Okay, we are going to be exploring acrylic paint techniques, and we're going to be talking about some of the techniques that you see here. And this will be displayed in the classroom for you to reference as well. But let's talk about the materials that we need first, okay? So each of you is going to need your ice cube tray of paint. If you already have some colors mixed in there or left over, don't get rid of those because you will probably still want them, but you will want to make sure that you have the primary colors, so a red, a yellow, and a blue, and white and black. And you'll see here with for my reds, I actually picked a cool, a warm, and then I actually used some of that magenta pink just for some better color mixing, okay? So that's okay there. The other materials you'll need is make sure that you have a brush. You are going to use your sketchbook, okay? I would prefer you to do this activity in your sketchbook. I'm going to be doing it on a separate piece of paper just because I'm not going to have time to let it dry in my sketchbook, but we'll talk about that. You potentially might want a plate for mixing. And then you are going to want to get your table number box with your materials in it, okay? So these have all of your painting materials in here. I will pull out and talk about this stuff as we use it, okay? So we will, oh, and then the other two things that you will want are a couple of cups of water. You need to make sure to have a sloppy copy down. I have a sloppy copy down, it's just white. And then you will probably want a paper towel handy, okay? So that's quite a few things, but we'll make sure that we have all of those things before we get started here. Okay, before we get started here, we need to set up our paper or our sketchbook. So like I said, I would prefer to use your sketchbook just so we have this all in one space. So we're gonna be exploring 11 different acrylic paint techniques. So what I would recommend doing is flipping open right now. So turning it this way and then so that you have like two blank pages facing each other here, okay? So we are going to start by just setting this up. So I would recommend doing like 3 on each page. So in this order, and this is the order that we'll be doing them in the video. So this is the way that I would write them down, okay? So we're gonna do tissue paper, sand, and graffito. If you need more time to write these or you don't know how to spell something, just pause the video and take a look at it, okay? So then I'm actually just gonna kind of divide these up. All right, and then my next ones that I'm going to do is I'm going to do, whoops, gradient, glaze, texture, and divide those up. Let's go ahead, flip the page. And so you won't get these all done in one day, which is why it's okay to do front and back, but it will just help you. If you have it open like this, you don't have to wait as much for something to dry. All right, so we should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, okay? So like I said, because I'm gonna be doing this all in one sitting where you guys are gonna be doing it different class periods, I'm actually just gonna do mine on a separate piece of paper here so that I don't have to worry about flipping my pages, okay? But you guys will be doing yours in here. The first 3 that we're gonna get started with: tissue paper, sand, and graffito. We actually have to do a little prep work before we can do these ones, okay? So we're actually not gonna paint these ones until later. So what you need for this is you need gesso, okay? So what it looks like in the little container is it just looks like white paint, but it is not white paint. It is more of a primer. So don't use this as if you were wanting to make a color lighter, okay? So you are going to need this, and then you should have a little Ziploc bag that has some tissue paper in it. You just need a little bit. Tear it off as you need to. Don't be wasteful of this. Like I said, we only need a little bit. Okay, so to begin, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this gesso, okay, which looks like the white paint, and I am just going to prepare it on the surface here as a primer. Okay, so then I'm going to take my tissue paper, and in order for this to work, we want it to be kind of crumpled up. So I'm gonna kind of press it down. So we're using this gesso kind of like a glue, and now we are going to paint over it to make it stick down as best we can. Okay, so we will come back to this one as it dries. It's okay if you can see the color of the tissue paper behind it, but we will get back to this one. You will probably get back to it in like another day to finish it off, okay? So the next one, we're gonna start the same way using the gesso and priming the surface. And now you are going to grab your container of sand. So be very careful with this because it will make a mess. Okay, so for this one, we are just going to kind of start by sprinkling the sand on here. From here, we really want to try to not get sand in this container of gesso. So I'm really going to load up my brush and kind of just glob it down here. And then what you are going to do is you're just going to carefully kind of mix those two together. Okay, so I got a lot of leftover gesso, so I'm going to use my paper towel here. And I'm going to sprinkle a little bit more sand on top. Okay, so at this point, we are done with the gesso and won't need to use that again, but we have to just make sure to let these dry. So I would go ahead and like rinse your brush out and start again so that you don't have gesso everywhere. Okay, so for this last one, graffito, we're not gonna finish it until later as well. And so here, you see the sand here? If you pick it up, that loose sand should fall off, but it shouldn't fall off from there. All right, so for this graffito, all you're going to do is you are going to pick a color. You can pick any color that you want. Okay, so we'll get back to this one later. So you will notice that I have 2 cups of water here. Okay, you can use this to rinse out your brush. So I would designate like a dirty cup and a clean cup, okay? So that if we, for some techniques later on, we're going to need that clean water, okay? But for now, it's very important if you rinse out your brush that you take a paper towel or on the edge of your sloppy copy, dry out that extra brush so that it's not super wet, okay? So you might see me use a little bit of water, just be careful with that. So for this next one, we are going to do a gradient. And what that means is that's one color going into another. So what I am going to use here is I am going to start with a blue, and I'm gonna fade it into a yellow. You'll notice as I'm dipping in here, I'm trying to keep these colors clean. So this is where you might do mixing with your palette knife if you wanna mix some colors together. So as I paint here with the second color, I'm starting from the bottom here, and then I'm bringing it up to overlap to kind of hopefully get some of that green in there, and then you'll just gently bring it down. The key for this one is that we do not want it to look like stripes. So every once in a while, you'll probably have to clean out your brush with the paper towel. Okay, so that is gradient. So the next one is glaze. And so this one we will start and then get back to it as well. So for this one, I am going to start with, again, just a color. So I'm going to use this color, and I'm just going to paint a couple of sections here. So this one, I have actually just used the solid color. Now what I would like you to do is create a little swatch just by dipping your brush into the clean water, getting that brush wet. And notice that it thins it out. You might even do that again. Okay, so we'll get back to this one. So what this technique is that we've just practiced is actually wash. So let's go ahead and do that as well. And I would recommend switching to a different color so you can see the difference. So I'm going to use one of these darker colors that I have mixed up. So for this one, once again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just dip in the water. Notice I'm not stirring, so that water still stays clean. What you can do too, if you want to, on your plate, is you can take this and kind of mix it around a little bit. Add a little bit more water, and it almost kind of turns it into like a watercolor. Okay, so then what you have here is a thinner paint color. Okay, so let's use this same idea for a graded wash. So what this means is it's going to go from dark to light. So in order to do that, I'm just going to start with the wash. Now, notice I'm not going to add color to it or any more paint. I'm just going to dip into that clean water and carefully start to kind of drag that color down. To make it lighter. Now, as you want it to go lighter, you'll have to use your paper towel to get rid of some of that paint. Use the clean water to kind of bring some of that down. Okay, so we've turned that into almost like a watercolor, okay? So let's go back to this one up here that is texture. So for this one, you are going to probably want like a plastic fork. You can use the end of your paintbrush, a toothpick, a paper clip, anything that you can kind of blend into. So I'm going to, and I encourage you to use a couple different colors for this. So I'm going to actually kind of use a gradient. Okay, so then you got to make sure that you work quickly here, and then while the paint is still wet, take whatever you want to use, kind of create some texture within that paint. It looks pretty cool. Like I said, you could also like take the back of a paintbrush, even a pencil, just wipe it off and kind of draw into that paint as well. Okay, for this one, we are going to do what is called impasto. And here's an example, and you can see that it is very, very textured. So what we're gonna do for this one is we're gonna kind of practice making this little wave. And we actually aren't going to be using a paintbrush. So what you'll do is you will want to use a palette knife, and I am going to kind of just draw that wave shape. So what you are going to do is, instead of using the brush, you are actually going to kind of use the palette knife to paint. So what I'm doing is I'm loading up, applying texture. Before you dip it into a new color, make sure to wipe it off. So then you can kind of scrape it together. It's gonna create a texture. If your palette knife is too big, another thing that you can use is actually like a popsicle stick, okay? But the whole point of this is we don't want to just over mix it together. We want the colors to stay a little bit separate. Okay, so then you can go in, fill in the background a little bit with some different colors. I'm gonna use, and it's almost like you're scraping the paint, but still continuing to load it up. So one of the things with this technique as well is if you're having a hard time controlling the palette knife, is you can load it up with your paintbrush as well. Like if you want something to be a little bit more detailed. So let's say you want a lot of paint on here. What you're going to do is you're just not going to fully mix this in. And you're going to use and leave those paint strokes behind. Okay, so it might kind of look a little bit messy, if you will, but it can create and provide some really good areas of texture. Okay, so that is the impasto technique. Okay, so now we are gonna go ahead and look at scumbling and loaded brush. So for this, I'm actually gonna kind of do scumbling a couple of times here. So what I'm going to start with scumbling is I'm going to just start with a light little wash here. Okay. So what scumbling is it's creating a different type of texture, almost kind of like scribbling, but you can do it in a variety of ways. So I'm going to use kind of a darker color here so you can see. So one of the things that you can do with scumbling is you can actually, it's just kind of creating a little bit of a texture with the brush. Okay, so I'm just kind of doing, blotting it down. Another way that you could kind of use it as well is actually kind of like almost scribbling with the paint, kind of doing tiny circles. That could add a little bit of texture and variety. But when you're doing this, it really works best if you're using another color. So for instance, let's go to some of this yellow here. If I want to give the illusion of something mixing together, okay, so that can kind of create a little bit more of texture and variety in our paints using a little bit of a different color. Another way that you can go about doing this is actually by using a sponge, okay? So you kind of want to make sure it's a little bit damp, so you could use your clean water and then just make sure to squeeze it out and then directly go into the paint. So for instance, this works really well to go over top of an area that might be a little bit wet. So I'm going to just kind of dip into the blue directly. Okay, and I'm also going to put on a little bit of white. So you could also just use your paintbrush. And then you can kind of add a little bit of a texture. Okay, so you can kind of see that down here. This sponging technique can just create a little bit of a variety for you. Just make sure that you aren't loading it up too much. And like I said, sometimes it works best to actually have some colors, a couple colors mixing together. Okay, so that's kind of a couple of combinations there that you can try out. Please make sure to clean this sponge out when you're done with it and put it back in your bin of materials. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the next one, which is going to be a loaded brush. So what that means is you are actually going to load up your brush with multiple colors at once. So what you'll see here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna load this up with yellow and the red. So you will kind of mix them a little bit, okay? But your paintbrush should kind of look like this. So it is loaded up. And then as you start to paint, it's going to create some of those colors naturally. So you could use this really well with a impasto technique, a little bit of texture. So you could use it, leave it kind of streaky like that, or excuse me, textured, or you might smooth it out more, okay? But you'll notice that it still creates, so even though there's not as much paint here, it still creates some of those nice colors. So you can do that with multiple colors. So watch what happens here when I use this pink. I use some of this blue and white. Okay, so it's going to kind of create just some different effects for you there. Okay, let's go back to some of these. So you don't want to, we need to go back over and work on glaze and graffito. So if it is not dry to the touch, like paint comes off on your hand, then you should wait. But we can go ahead, and these two are dry. This one looks like it's still drying for me, so I'm gonna wait. So for graffito, this one is really close to the texture one, except we're gonna scrape away the surface on top. So what you will do, and you could do this with any type of technique. So you want to make sure that you're using a color that is contrasting. So for instance, if I put like this color over top of it, probably not going to do a lot for the contrast. So that you can really see it, I'm going to actually just paint over this solid black. So then with this part, got to make sure that you're still doing this when it's wet. You could use the texture tools again. You could even use the palette knife. And what you're going to do is scrape away, and it's going to reveal whatever color or design is underneath of it. So this can look really cool with a gradient pattern. Really any design underneath of it, okay? So that is what the graffito technique is. Okay, so let's go back to glaze. So these were close to the wash and the graded wash. So with this one, this allows you to layer colors in a little bit of a different way. So we're gonna do that same thing as we kind of did with the washes here this time. So I'm gonna layer over with, I'll do a couple different colors, but I'll start with this pink. And I'm actually gonna kind of mix this a little bit. Okay, so I kind of made like a lighter pink. So then I'm going to go back, and remember, you could use your clean water and actually stir it into here. Okay, so what I'm going to do then, and I'm just going to do one right over top of here, is what this does is it allows you to layer over top of it. Yet you can still see the colors underneath of it. So notice here where we had the darker area, we can still see over top of it, but it's not as contrasting as we go down here. This is a really great way to build layers and add things on top of each other. So you could go over here, and let's say you even wanted to fill it in solid over top of it. You're still going to get some of that color that is underneath of it. Okay, so that is what a glaze will do. And here's an example of how you could actually use a glaze. So you can kind of see this little cactus drawing that we have here. You could use it to layer on top of, almost kind of like a little bit of watercolor. Okay, so use this to kind of look at any of the techniques on there. There's a lot of different things that you can do with them. So for instance, like take a look at this one, loaded brush with colored pencil over top of it. You can do a lot of really cool things with it. So we'll get back to the tissue paper and the sand when it dries. Okay, so we are ready to finish these ones up. So if I put my finger over top, the stuff isn't moving and I'm not getting stuff on my hands, okay? So you're going to need quite a bit of paint for these ones. So what you're going to do is you are just going to cover over top. I would recommend mixing colors together. Okay, so you can see that we can see some of that texture underneath of there. Where I have colors more like the loaded brush mixed together, we can see that tissue paper detail even a little bit more. So when this dries, I'll show you something else that we can do with it as well. But then I'm just going to kind of use the same colors as I was using here for the sand. This one you're going to need a lot more paint on, okay? Because you kind of have to like dab the paintbrush in. Once again, with this technique, it's going to start creating some texture, but it's going to look better when we are using a variety of colors. Okay, so to finish these last two off, I'm going to show you how to add a little bit of extra. If you see on this one here, there's a way that we can kind of accent that texture a little bit, and I'll show you how to do that. So it works best if you're using kind of a contrasting color. I always kind of like to use a maybe metallic color a little bit, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of paint just on a paper towel here. And I'm just going to kind of blot this on. And then I'm going to take a clean portion of my paper towel and kind of start gently rubbing away using a circular motion. So then what that does is it keeps the colors underneath but brings out some of that texture. So you could try that with a bunch of different colors. If the paper towel isn't working, you can try to use a sponge. So with the sand, we're going to do something a little bit, we're going to do something similar. But here, I'm using kind of the same color combination. But here I'm just going to kind of lightly go over it. So I'm using kind of a brown color. So I don't have very much paint on here. But as I rub over top of it, it is getting some of that sand grain texture, okay? So that's another way that you can accent that color a little bit. Let me show you what happens when we use a little bit of a lighter color. So I just have white right here. Okay, so it'll work with light or dark colors. There can just be a variety of things that you do to bring out that texture.